Picture this. It is September 12th, 1683, and you are standing on a hill outside Vienna. Below you, the greatest city in Central Europe is dying. For 2 months, the Ottoman Empire has been strangling it. 300,000 soldiers surround the walls. They have built a city of tents larger than Vienna itself. Every day, they dig closer. Every night, you hear the explosions as their mines collapse another section of wall. The siege lines look like a noose tightening around a throat. Inside the city, 16,000 defenders are down to their last few thousand able-bodied men. They are eating rats. They are burning furniture for warmth. The hospitals overflow with wounded who have no medicine, and dying men who have no priest. The walls that have stood for centuries are crumbling. In 3 days, maybe 4, the Ottomans will break through. When they do, Vienna will burn. Every man will be killed or enslaved. Every woman and child will be dragged to the markets of Constantinople. But you are not looking at Vienna. You are looking behind you, at the forest. And from that forest, something is emerging that will save Europe. 18,000 Polish cavalry are forming up on the slopes. At their head rides King Jan Sobieski, a man the Ottomans already fear. He has spent his entire life killing them. Today, he is about to do it again on a scale that will echo through history. The king turns in his saddle. He looks at the city below, at the green flags of Islam flying over the siege works, at the Ottoman camp spreading across the plain like a cancer. He raises his hand. Trumpets blast across the hillside. 18,000 horses begin to move. The ground shakes. The largest cavalry charge in human history is about to smash into the Ottoman Empire like the fist of God. What happens in the next 4 hours will not just save Vienna. It will break the myth of Ottoman invincibility forever. It will turn the tide of 3 centuries of Islamic expansion into Europe. And it will prove that sometimes the most important battles in history are not won by the largest armies, but by the ones who arrive at exactly the right moment with exactly the right weapon. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why Vienna mattered so much, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire represented in 1683. This was not some distant threat. This was the superpower of the age. For 300 years, the Ottomans had been expanding in every direction. They had conquered Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. They had swallowed the Balkans, Hungary, and most of North Africa. Their armies had reached the gates of Vienna once before, in 1529, and nearly taken it. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Morocco, from the Crimea to Yemen. It controlled the Mediterranean Sea, the trade routes to Asia, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Sultan in Constantinople ruled over 70 million people. The Habsburg Emperor in Vienna ruled over 8 million. On paper, this was not a fair fight. But the Ottomans were not just powerful, they were terrifying. Their elite infantry, the Janissaries, were taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained to be fanatics. They fought with a discipline that European armies envied. Their cavalry, the Sipahi, were born in the saddle and feared across 3 continents, and their artillery was the best in the world. The massive bronze cannons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople were now pointed at Vienna. The Grand Vizier leading this invasion was Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was not a soldier promoted for battlefield brilliance. He was a politician who had clawed his way to power through the palace intrigues of Constantinople. But he was ambitious, ruthlessly so. He looked at a map of Europe and saw an empire ripe for conquest. He convinced the Sultan that Vienna was the key. Take Vienna, and the road to Germany lay open. Take Germany, and all of Europe would fall like dominoes. Kara Mustafa assembled the largest Ottoman army ever sent into Europe. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but even conservative estimates put it at over 150,000 fighting men, supported by another 100,000 laborers, engineers, and camp followers. It was a moving city of conquest. They brought siege guns that weighed tons. They brought thousands of camels loaded with supplies. They brought miners from the Balkans who knew how to dig under walls and collapsed them with explosives. The army left Constantinople in the spring of 1683. As it marched through the Balkans, it grew larger. Vassals and allies joined. Crimean Tatars brought their light cavalry. Moldavian and Wallachian princes brought tribute and troops. By the time the army reached Hungary, it was the largest force the Ottomans had ever fielded on European soil. The march was a statement of power. Villages along the route were ordered to provide food, or they were burned. The Ottoman war machine did not ask for permission. It took what it needed. By mid-July, the vanguard reached the outskirts of Vienna. The siege began on July 14th, 1683, and from that moment, the clock started ticking for the city and for all of Christian Europe. Inside Vienna, the situation was desperate from day one. The city was not prepared for a siege of this scale. The walls were old, built in medieval times when cannons were smaller and less effective. The garrison was weak. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, had fled the city weeks before the Ottomans arrived. He took his court, his treasury, and his best troops with him. It was not cowardly, it was pragmatic. If the emperor was captured, the war was over. But his departure left the defense in the hands of a single man, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Starhemberg was only 30 years old, but he was a veteran of wars against the Turks and the French. He was not a genius. He was not a charismatic hero. He was a stubborn, methodical officer who refused to panic. When he looked at the walls of Vienna and the size of the army surrounding them, he did not see victory. He saw a math problem. He had 16,000 soldiers, most of them militia and volunteers. He had food for maybe 2 months if rationed carefully. He had gunpowder, but not enough. He had walls, but they were crumbling. The Ottomans did not storm the walls immediately. They were too smart for that. Kara Mustafa knew that assaults cost lives, and he wanted to take Vienna intact. A city captured by storm could be looted by the soldiers. A city that surrendered could be looted by the Grand Vizier. So he ordered his engineers to dig. They began tunneling under the walls, packing the tunnels with barrels of gunpowder, and collapsing entire sections in massive explosions. The defenders responded with counter-tunneling. They dug their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman miners underground. What followed was a war beneath the city. Men fought in the dark with knives and shovels. They set off explosions to collapse enemy tunnels, burying men alive. It was claustrophobic, brutal combat, where you could not see your enemy until he was on top of you. Both sides lost hundreds of men in the tunnels, crushed by cave-ins or killed in the blackness. Above ground, the Ottomans bombarded the city day and night. Their cannons fired stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. Each impact shook the ground. Buildings near the walls were pulverized into rubble. Fires broke out constantly. The noise was relentless, a hammering roar that never stopped. Inside the city, morale began to crack. Soldiers who had been confident in July were exhausted by August. Civilians, who had stayed to defend their homes, began to regret that choice. Starhemberg walked the walls every day. He made himself visible. He did not hide in a palace while his men bled. He ate the same rations they did. He slept in the same bombed-out buildings. He knew that if the men saw their commander suffering with them, they would hold longer. And hold they did. But barely. By late August, the situation was critical. Entire sections of the wall had collapsed. The Ottomans were preparing for a final assault. Inside the city, the defenders were down to a few thousand able-bodied men. The hospitals were filled with the wounded, the starving, and the dying. Disease was spreading. Dysentery and typhus killed as many men as Ottoman bullets. Starhemberg sent messengers out of the city under cover of darkness. The messages were simple and desperate. If relief does not come in days, Vienna will fall. The messengers rode west, through Ottoman patrols, through hostile territory, racing to find the only men who could save the city. They were looking for the imperial army, gathering in Bavaria. They were looking for the Germans. And most importantly, they were looking for the Poles. The man who received those desperate messages was not a king. Not yet. He was Jan Sobieski, and he had been killing Ottomans since he was old enough to hold a sword. Born in 1629 into a noble Polish family, Sobieski grew up on the frontier, where Poland bordered the Ottoman vassal states. This was a land of constant raids, skirmishes, and small wars. The Ottomans and their Tatar allies would sweep north to capture slaves and plunder. The Poles would ride south for revenge. It was a cycle of violence that had gone on for generations. Sobieski was not born to be king. He was a soldier. He fought in the wars against the Cossacks, the Swedes, and the Russians. But his real education came fighting the Turks. In 1673, he won a crushing victory at the Battle of Kotin, where he led a desperate charge that broke a massive Ottoman army. The battle made him a hero across Poland. When the Polish king died that same year, the nobles looked for a strong leader who could defend the realm. They elected Sobieski. He became King Jan III. But Sobieski was not like other kings. He did not sit on a throne and issue orders. He led from the front. He wore armor that bore the scars of a dozen battles. He carried a saber that had personally killed more men than most soldiers ever faced. And he hated the Ottomans, with a passion born from decades of watching them burn his country. When the call for help came from Vienna, Sobieski did not hesitate. He knew what an Ottoman victory would mean. If Vienna fell, Poland was next. The Ottomans would not stop at the Danube. They would keep pushing north until they controlled all of Central Europe. This was not about saving Austria. This was about survival. But convincing the Polish nobility to march was another matter. Poland was not an absolute monarchy. The king needed the approval of the Sejm, the assembly of nobles, to raise an army. And the nobles were divided. Some wanted to help Vienna. Others argued that Austria had been Poland's enemy in the past and deserved whatever happened. Some simply did not want to spend money on a foreign war. Sobieski addressed the Sejm in person. He did not appeal to their charity. He appealed to their fear. He told them that the Ottomans were not going to stop at Vienna. He told them that if the Habsburgs fell, Poland would face the full weight of the Ottoman Empire alone. He reminded them of the raids, the burnings, the tens of thousands of Poles dragged into slavery over the decades. He asked them if they wanted their children to grow up as slaves in Constantinople. The speech worked. The Sejm agreed to send an army. But there was a problem. Poland was broke. The royal treasury was empty. Sobieski did something extraordinary. He mortgaged his own estates. He borrowed money from Italian bankers. He pawned the crown jewels. He turned his personal fortune into an army, because he knew that without one, there would be no kingdom left to rule. By late August, Sobieski had assembled a force of 27,000 men. It was not a large army by the standards of the age, but it was elite. The core of the force was the famous Polish winged hussars. These were not ordinary cavalry. They were the shock troops of Eastern Europe, heavy cavalry armed with 18-foot lances and wearing wings made of eagle feathers strapped to their backs. The wings made a terrifying sound when they charged, a rushing roar that sounded like a storm descending. Enemies who had never faced them often broke and ran at the sight and sound alone. The hussars were expensive to maintain. Each man was a noble who provided his own horse, armor, and weapons. They trained from childhood. They were not conscripts or mercenaries. They were professionals who saw war as their family business. And they were the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, perhaps in the world. Sobieski also brought dragoons, infantry, and light cavalry. But everyone knew the battle would be decided by the hussars. They were the hammer. Everything else was just there to hold the enemy in place so the hammer could fall. The Polish army marched west in early September. They moved fast, covering over 20 miles a day. Sobieski knew that speed was everything. Every day he delayed was another day Vienna might fall. As they marched, they were joined by other forces. The Holy Roman Emperor had finally assembled an imperial army under Charles of Lorraine. The Germans brought 30,000 men. The Saxons sent a contingent. The Bavarians arrived with their own forces. By the time they reached the Vienna woods on September 11th, the relief army numbered around 70,000 men. It was a massive force, but no one knew if it was enough. The Ottomans still had over 150,000 men. The numbers favored the defenders of the siege, not the rescuers. On the night of September 11th, Sobieski and the other commanders met in a small church in the Vienna woods. They could see the glow of fires from Vienna in the distance. They could hear the rumble of Ottoman cannons. The city was still standing, but barely. Scouts reported that the Ottomans were preparing a final assault. If the relief force did not attack immediately, they would arrive to find a city in ruins and an enemy drunk on victory. The plan was simple, but audacious. The imperial forces would attack from the north, engaging the Ottoman left flank and drawing their attention. The Germans and Saxons would hit the center. And Sobieski, with his Poles, would sweep down from the hills on the right, smashing into the Ottoman flank with the full weight of the winged hussars. It was a plan that required perfect coordination. If any part of the attack failed, the entire relief force could be destroyed piecemeal. But there was no time for a better plan. As the sun set on September 11th, Sobieski knelt in the church and prayed. He prayed for his men, for Vienna, and for victory. Then he stood, walked outside, and gave the order. At dawn, they would attack. The morning of September 12th, 1683, began with fog. It rolled through the Vienna woods like a living thing, obscuring the hills and valleys. For the Christian forces assembling in the forest, the fog was a blessing. It hid their movements from Ottoman scouts. For the Ottomans, it was an omen. Their sentries stared into the white wall and saw nothing, heard nothing, but they felt something, a tension in the air, a sense that the world was about to change. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg stood on the shattered remnants of the city wall. He had received word the night before that relief was coming. A messenger had slipped through the Ottoman lines with the news. Sobieski was here. The imperial army was here. They would attack today. Starhemberg looked at his men, exhausted, starving, down to their last reserves of strength. He told them to hold for one more day. Just one more day. At 6 in the morning, the fog began to lift. And as it did, the Ottomans finally saw what was coming for them. On the hills to the north and west, banners were unfurling. Thousands of them. The standards of the Holy Roman Empire, the black eagle on gold, the banners of Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia, and on the far right, the white eagle of Poland. The entire skyline was filled with armies. Kara Mustafa was not at the front lines. He was in his tent, a massive silk pavilion that was more palace than shelter. When his officers brought him the news, he did not panic. He had been expecting this. He knew the Christians would try to relieve Vienna. He had planned for it. He pulled his forces back from the walls and formed them into a defensive line facing west. He had superior numbers. He had fortified positions. He had done everything right. But Kara Mustafa made a critical error. He divided his attention. He kept a large portion of his army still focused on Vienna, still trying to take the city even as a relief force approached. He could not let go of the prize. He thought he could fight on two fronts. He thought he could hold the Christians long enough to break into Vienna, sack it, and then turn to deal with the relief army. It was a gamble. It was also a fatal mistake. The battle began at 8 in the morning. The imperial forces, under Charles of Lorraine, attacked first, driving into the Ottoman left. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Ottoman janissaries, the elite infantry, formed ranks and fired volley after volley. The imperial troops, Germans, and Austrians pushed forward with pikes and muskets. It was a grinding, shoving match where neither side gave ground easily. In the center, the Saxons and Bavarians engaged the Ottoman center. This was the heaviest fighting of the morning. The Ottomans had positioned artillery on the high ground, and they used it to devastating effect. Cannonballs tore through the advancing infantry. Men were cut in half by the impacts. Entire files disappeared in clouds of red mist. But the Christians kept coming. They advanced over their own dead, firing as they walked, reloading behind the bodies of their comrades. For hours, the battle was a stalemate. The Christians were pushing, but slowly. The Ottomans were holding, but barely. By noon, both sides were exhausted. The fighting had devolved into a brutal melee where units hacked at each other with swords and axes. The ground was slick with blood. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. And then the fog, on the right flank, lifted completely, and the Poles appeared. Sobieski had been holding back. He had watched the imperial forces engage. He had waited for the Ottomans to commit their reserves. He had waited for the perfect moment. And now, at 1 in the afternoon, that moment had arrived. He turned to his winged hussars. 18,000 of them formed into a massive wedge on the slopes of the Kahlenberg Hill. The sunlight glinted off their armor. The wings on their backs rustled in the wind. Sobieski did not give a speech. He did not need to. These men knew what to do. They had done it 100 times before. He drew his saber, raised it high, and pointed it at the Ottoman flank. The trumpets sounded. The drums began to beat, and 18,000 Polish cavalrymen began to move. At first, it was a walk. The horses picked their way down the steep slopes carefully. The riders kept formation, knee to knee, a solid wall of steel and horseflesh. As the ground leveled out, the walk became a trot. The trot became a canter. And then, as they hit the open plain, the canter became a full gallop. The sound was like thunder. 18,000 hooves striking the ground in unison created a vibration that could be felt a mile away. The Ottoman soldiers on the flank turned and saw what was coming for them. They saw the wings, the lances, the wall of death accelerating toward them. Some tried to form ranks. Some fired their muskets. Some simply ran. It did not matter. The charge of the winged hussars at Vienna was the largest cavalry charge in history. It was an unstoppable force of nature. The Polish lances, 18 feet long, struck first. At full gallop. The kinetic energy was immense. The lances punched through Ottoman armor, through flesh, through bone. Men were lifted off their feet and thrown backward. Horses were impaled and collapsed, screaming. The first line of Ottoman defenders did not just break. They evaporated. But the hussars did not stop. They kept going. The lances shattered on impact, so the riders drew their sabers and kept cutting. The horses themselves were weapons, trained to bite and trample. The charge was not a single impact. It was a rolling wave of destruction that just kept coming. The second line hit, then the third, then the fourth. The Ottoman flank collapsed. Not slowly, not in an organized retreat, but in an instant. One moment there was a defensive line. The next, there was a mob of terrified men running for their lives. And the Poles pursued them. They cut down anyone who was too slow. They rode over anyone who fell. It was not a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. Sobieski himself was in the thick of it. At 54 years old, he was not a young man, but he fought like one. Eyewitnesses described him swinging his saber with both hands, cutting through Ottoman soldiers like wheat. His household guards surrounded him, but he did not need protection. He was the most dangerous man on the battlefield. As the Polish cavalry tore through the Ottoman flank, the entire enemy line began to unravel. The Janissaries in the center, who had been holding firm against the imperial forces, suddenly found themselves surrounded. They fought with the desperation of trapped animals, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Saxon and Bavarian infantry, who had been struggling all morning, suddenly found the pressure lifting. They pushed forward, gaining ground they had paid for in blood hours earlier. By 4 in the afternoon, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. It was not an organized withdrawal. It was a rout. Entire units threw down their weapons and ran. Officers abandoned their men. The discipline that had made the Ottoman army so feared for centuries simply vanished. Tens of thousands of soldiers were fleeing south, desperate to reach the Danube and cross to safety. Kara Mustafa, watching from his command tent, finally understood that he had lost. He ordered the retreat, but the order was unnecessary. His army was already running. He mounted his horse and fled with them, leaving behind his tent, his treasure, and his dignity. The Christian forces pursued. The cavalry, fresh from their charge, hunted down the stragglers. The infantry advanced into the Ottoman camp, which was a city unto itself. What they found was beyond imagination. Kara Mustafa had brought the wealth of an empire with him. There were chests of gold coins. There were silks and carpets worth fortunes. There were exotic animals, including an ostrich that had been brought as a gift for the Sultan. There were thousands of camels loaded with supplies. There were weapons, armor, and cannons. But there was also horror. In the tents, The Christians found captives, thousands of them, men, women, and children who had been taken in raids across Hungary and Austria. Some had been slaves for years. Some had been captured just weeks before. They were freed, blinking in the sunlight, unable to believe the nightmare was over. The Ottomans left behind over 10,000 dead on the battlefield. Thousands more drowned trying to cross the Danube. The Christians lost around 4,000 men, most of them in the brutal fighting of the morning. It was a lopsided victory, the kind that changes the course of history. As the sun set on September 12th, Sobieski rode into Vienna. The city gates opened, and the population poured into the streets. They were skeletal, filthy, exhausted, but they were alive. They cheered until their voices gave out. They reached up to touch his horse, his boots, his hands. They wept openly. Starhemberg, the man who had held the city together for 2 months, rode out to meet him. The two men embraced. No words were necessary. That night, Sobieski wrote a letter to his wife. In it, he paraphrased Julius Caesar. He wrote, "We came, we saw, God conquered." It was not boasting. It was a statement of fact. The largest Ottoman army ever assembled in Europe had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. The tide of Islamic expansion into Europe, which had been flowing for 3 centuries, had finally been stopped. But the victory at Vienna was not just about stopping an invasion. It was the beginning of something much larger. The Ottomans had been humiliated in front of the entire world. The empire that had terrified Europe for generations had been broken by a coalition army, led by a Polish king. The psychological impact was immense. Christian kingdoms that had spent decades on the defensive suddenly saw an opportunity. If the Ottomans could be beaten at Vienna, they could be beaten elsewhere. Within months, the Habsburgs launched a counteroffensive into Hungary. The territories that had been under Ottoman control for over a century were suddenly being liberated. The Ottomans tried to hold the line, but their morale was shattered. Soldiers who had once fought with the confidence of an empire now fought with the desperation of a losing cause. City after city fell. Buda, the capital of Ottoman Hungary, was recaptured in 1686 after 143 years of Islamic rule. The war that followed Vienna, known as the Great Turkish War, lasted until 1699. It ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz, where the Ottomans were forced to cede massive territories. Hungary, Transylvania, and most of the Balkans were lost. It was the first time in history that the Ottoman Empire had signed a treaty where they gave up land instead of taking it. The empire that had expanded for 400 years was now contracting. The psychological wound went deeper than the territorial losses. For centuries, the Ottomans had believed they were destined to conquer Europe. They believed that Islam would spread across the continent, just as it had spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. The victory at Vienna shattered that belief. It proved that Christian Europe could unite when it needed to. It proved that the Ottoman military, for all its power, was not invincible. The defeat also had internal consequences for the empire. Kara Mustafa, the Grand Vizier who had led the invasion, was executed on December 25th, 1683. The Sultan ordered him strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method of execution for high officials. His head was sent to Constantinople and displayed as a warning, but killing Kara Mustafa did not fix the underlying problem. The Ottoman Empire had been built on conquest. Without new territories to plunder, without new slaves to take, the empire's economy began to stagnate. The military reforms, needed to compete with European armies, were expensive and difficult. The empire began a long, slow decline that would last for over 200 years until its final collapse in World War I. For Poland, the victory at Vienna was bittersweet. Sobieski returned home a hero, celebrated across Europe as the savior of Christendom. The Pope called him the defender of the faith. Kings and princes sent him gifts and letters of gratitude. But Poland itself gained almost nothing from the victory. The Austrians took control of the recaptured Hungarian territories. Poland was left with debts, exhausted armies, and a nobility that went back to squabbling over domestic politics. Sobieski spent the last years of his life trying to hold his fractured kingdom together. He launched campaigns against the Ottomans in Moldavia, winning battles but failing to secure lasting victories. He watched as Poland's neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, grew stronger while Poland grew weaker. He died in 1696, frustrated and tired. Within a century of his death, Poland would be partitioned by its neighbors and erased from the map. The nation that had saved Europe could not save itself, but the legacy of Vienna lived on. The battle became a symbol of European resilience. It was proof that even when the situation seemed hopeless, even when the enemy surrounded you and the walls were crumbling, salvation could come from an unexpected direction. The image of the winged hussars charging down the hill became one of the most iconic moments in military history. It was painted, written about, and celebrated for centuries. In Vienna itself, the gratitude was immediate and lasting. The city commissioned massive Baroque churches to thank God for their deliverance. The Karlskirche, one of the most beautiful buildings in Vienna, was built as a plague church, but its construction was directly inspired by the gratitude felt after the siege. The city's culture, its architecture, its identity, was shaped by the memory of those 2 months when it stood alone against an empire and survived. The battle also had a strange cultural legacy. The Ottomans left behind sacks of coffee beans in their abandoned camp. The Viennese, who had never seen coffee before, began brewing it. The first coffee house in Vienna opened shortly after the siege, using beans captured from the Ottomans. Today, Viennese coffee culture is world famous, a direct result of the siege. The croissant, that symbol of French baking, is also said to have been invented in Vienna to celebrate the victory. Its crescent shape mocked the crescent moon on the Ottoman flag. These small cultural details matter because they show how deeply the siege impacted the city. It was not just a military event, it was a civilizational moment. Vienna became a symbol of the border between East and West, between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. The fact that it held, that it survived, meant that Europe would develop along a different path than it might have if the Ottomans had broken through. Looking back from the present day, it is hard to overstate how close Europe came to a very different future. If Vienna had fallen, if Sobieski had been delayed by a week, if the charge had failed, the Ottoman Empire would have had access to southern Germany. The Holy Roman Empire would have been split in two. France, always opportunistic, might have used the chaos to expand eastward. The balance of power that defined European politics for the next 2 centuries would have been completely different. Some historians argue that the Battle of Vienna was one of the 15 decisive battles in world history, a list that includes Thermopylae, Tours, Hastings, and Waterloo. It was a hinge point where history turned. The Ottoman Empire went from expansion to decline. The Habsburg Empire went from defense to offense. And Poland, for one brief shining moment, was the hero of all Christendom before its own tragic collapse. The military lessons of Vienna were studied by officers for generations. The importance of relief forces, the value of cavalry used at the right moment, the danger of divided attention in siege warfare. Kara Mustafa's mistake, trying to take Vienna while also preparing to fight a field battle, became a textbook example of overreach. Sobieski's patience, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash his hussars, became a masterclass in timing. The battle also demonstrated the importance of leadership. Starhemberg inside Vienna, holding together a starving, desperate garrison for 2 months, showed what stubborn determination could achieve. Sobieski, leading from the front at age 54, showed that personal courage still mattered even in an age of gunpowder. Charles of Lorraine, coordinating the imperial forces to pin the Ottomans in place, showed that supporting roles are just as crucial as the dramatic charge. Perhaps the most important lesson, though, was about unity. Europe in 1683 was a fractured mess of competing kingdoms, religions, and languages. Catholics and Protestants had been killing each other for decades in the 30 Years' War. Poland and Austria had been rivals for generations. The German states were a patchwork of duchies and principalities that could barely agree on anything. But when Vienna was threatened, they put aside their differences. They assembled an army from a dozen different nations and languages. They fought together, and they won. That unity did not last. Within years, they were back to fighting each other. But for one moment, they had shown what was possible. The memory of that moment became part of the European identity. It became proof that when the continent faced an existential threat, it could unite. That memory would be invoked again in later centuries, during the Napoleonic Wars, during World War I, during World War II. The idea that Europe could set aside its internal quarrels to face a common enemy traces back, in part, to the fields outside Vienna. The Ottoman soldiers who survived the battle carried the trauma with them. Stories spread through the empire about the winged demons who had descended from the hills. The Janissaries, who had been the terror of battlefields for centuries, had been routed by Christian cavalry. The psychological damage was profound. In future battles, Ottoman soldiers would hesitate when facing European cavalry. That hesitation, that loss of confidence, was as damaging as the loss of territory. The Battle of Vienna also marked a technological shift. The Ottomans had built their empire using superior gunpowder weapons. Their cannons had broken the walls of Constantinople. Their Janissaries had mastered volley fire before most European armies. But by 1683, Europe had caught up and in some ways surpassed them. The imperial artillery at Vienna was as good as the Ottoman guns. The muskets were more reliable. The tactical innovations, combined arms tactics, the effective use of cavalry and infantry together were more advanced. The Ottomans failed to adapt. Their military system was conservative, resistant to change. The Janissary Corps, once an elite force, had become a bloated, politically powerful institution that resisted reform. When European armies began modernizing in the 18th century, adopting new tactics and weapons, the Ottomans fell further behind. The gap that appeared at Vienna only widened with time. In the end, the Battle of Vienna was about more than tactics and territory. It was about the future direction of an entire continent. It was about whether Europe would remain Christian or become Islamic. It was about whether the Ottoman Empire would continue its relentless expansion or be forced to stop. And it was about whether a coalition of fractious, quarrelsome kingdoms could unite when it mattered most. On September 12, 1683, all of those questions were answered. The largest cavalry charge in history smashed into the Ottoman flank and changed everything. The city that had been dying was saved. The empire that had been unstoppable was stopped. And the king who led the charge became a legend. Today, if you visit Vienna, you can walk the streets that were once rubble. You can see the palaces that were built in the years after the siege, monuments to the city's survival and revival. You can visit the churches where the defenders prayed for deliverance. You can stand on the Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski assembled his cavalry, and look down at the city spread out below. The view is the same. The hill is the same, but the world is different. The Battle of Vienna reminds us that history is not inevitable. The experts in 1683 thought Vienna would fall. They thought the Ottoman advance was unstoppable. They thought Europe's best days were behind it. They were wrong. A stubborn garrison, a desperate king, and 18,000 cavalry proved them wrong in the span of a single afternoon. It reminds us that sometimes the most important victories are not won by the largest armies or the wealthiest empires. They are won by the ones who refuse to surrender, who hold on just a little longer, who charge when everyone else says retreat. The defenders of Vienna had every reason to give up. They were outnumbered, outgunned, starving, and dying. But they did not quit. They held the walls for one more day, and that one more day was enough. And it reminds us that leadership matters. Kara Mustafa had every advantage: numbers, supplies, position, time. But he made critical mistakes. He divided his forces. He underestimated his enemy. He let arrogance cloud his judgment. Sobieski had fewer advantages, but he used them perfectly. He waited for the right moment. He struck at the right place. He led from the front. In war, as in life, competence and courage matter more than raw power. The Ottoman Empire never recovered from Vienna. The next century would see them lose battle after battle, territory after territory, prestige after prestige. The empire that had made Europe tremble for 300 years became the sick man of Europe, kept alive only because the great powers could not agree on how to divide its corpse. When it finally collapsed in 1923, the end had been written at Vienna 240 years earlier. For Austria, Vienna was the beginning of a golden age. The Habsburg Empire expanded eastward, reclaiming lands lost for generations. The wealth that poured in from reconquered territories funded an explosion of art, architecture, and music. The Vienna of Mozart, Beethoven, and Strauss was built on the foundation laid in 1683. The city became a capital of European culture, a beacon of the Enlightenment, precisely because it had survived when it should have fallen. For Poland, the legacy is more tragic. The nation that saved Europe could not save itself. Within a century, it would be partitioned by its neighbors and disappear from maps for over 100 years. But the memory of Sobieski and his winged hussars lived on in the Polish heart. When Poland finally regained independence in 1918, the image of the charge at Vienna became a symbol of national pride. It was proof that Poland had once been great, that it had stood at the center of European history, that it had mattered. The charge itself, that moment when 18,000 cavalry descended from the Kahlenberg, has been studied by military historians ever since. It represents the pinnacle of cavalry warfare, the perfect execution of a mounted assault. Everything had to go right: the coordination with the infantry, the timing of the charge, the terrain, the weather, the morale of the troops. Any one of those factors being wrong could have turned triumph into disaster. But everything aligned, and for a few hours on a September afternoon, war looked like art. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hills above Vienna. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battle that broke the Ottoman Empire and saved Europe, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel survive the algorithm. Make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you do not miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Vienna was truly a turning point in history? Or would the Ottoman expansion have stalled regardless? Could Poland have used its victory to secure its own future? Let us discuss it down below. Until next time, remember, history is not just about what happened. It is about who survived to tell the story. And on September 12th, 1683, it was Vienna that survived, Poland that charged, and the Ottoman Empire that learned to fear the Austrians forever.